It started with a whisper, faint, almost imperceptible, like the rustling of leaves on a windless night. At first, I thought it was my imagination, just the creaks and groans of an old house settling into the earth. But as the days turned into weeks, the whispers grew louder, more distinct, and undeniably real. I live alone, in a small, secluded house on the edge of the woods. It's the kind of place people describe as peaceful. But I've always found it unnervingly quiet. The silence here is heavy, almost oppressive, as if the world itself is holding its breath. And now, that silence has been broken by something I can't explain. The whispers always come at night. They start around 2 a.m., soft and distant, like a conversation happening just out of earshot. At first, I couldn't make out any words, just a low, murmuring hum. But as the nights went on, the whispers became clearer. They weren't random noises, they were voices, and they were calling my name. The first time I saw the shadows, I thought it was a trick of the light. It was late, and I was sitting in my living room trying to distract myself with a book. The whispers had started again, faint but persistent, and I was doing my best to ignore them. That's when I noticed it. A flicker of movement in the corner of my eye. I turned my head, but there was nothing there. Just the dim glow of the lamp and the empty room beyond. I told myself it was nothing, just my tired mind playing tricks on me. But then it happened again, and again. Each time the movement was closer, more distinct. It wasn't until the third night that I realized what I was seeing. They weren't just shadows. They were figures. The figures were tall and thin, their forms barely distinguishable from the darkness around them. They didn't move like people. Their motions were jerky, unnatural, as if they were struggling to maintain their shape. And their faces, if you could call them that, were featureless voids, blacker than the night itself. They didn't seem to notice me at first. They lingered at the edges of the room, their heads tilted as if listening to something I couldn't hear. But then, one of them turned toward me. It didn't have eyes, but I could feel its gaze, cold and piercing, like a blade slicing through my soul. That's when the whispers stopped. For a moment, the silence was absolute. Even the usual creaks and groans of the house seemed to vanish, leaving only the sound of my own ragged breathing. And then, the whispers returned, but this time they weren't coming from the shadows. They were inside my head. "You can see us now," they said, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of sound. "You've always been able to see us. You just didn't want to." I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything but sit there frozen in terror. But I couldn't move. It was as if the shadows had rooted me to the spot, their unseen hands holding me in place. And then they began to move closer. As the shadows closed in, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They spoke of things I didn't understand, ancient secrets, forgotten names, and a darkness older than the world itself. They told me I was chosen, though they wouldn't say for what. And then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, they were gone. The room was empty, the whispers had stopped, but the silence that followed was worse than anything I had ever experienced. It wasn't the silence of an empty house. It was the silence of something watching, waiting, just out of sight. It's been 3 weeks since that night, and the whispers haven't returned. The shadows are gone, but I can still feel their presence, lingering at the edges of my vision. I've tried to convince myself it was all a hallucination, a product of stress and isolation. But deep down, I know the truth. They're still here. They've always been here. And now that I've seen them, they'll never let me go. It was supposed to be a normal hike. Just me, the trees, and the quiet escape from the chaos of everyday life. I've always loved the woods. There's something calming about the way the sunlight filters through the leaves, the sound of birds chirping, and the crunch of twigs underfoot. But that day, the woods felt different. The air was heavier, the silence deeper, and the shadows seemed to stretch just a little too far. I was about 2 miles into the trail when I saw it. A small, leather-bound book lying in the dirt, half buried under a pile of leaves. At first, I thought it was just trash, something someone had carelessly left behind. But as I picked it up, I realized it wasn't just any book. It was a diary. The leather was cracked and worn, and the edges of the pages were yellowed with age. There was no name on the cover, no indication of who it belonged to. I should have left it there. I should have turned around and walked away, but curiosity got the better of me. and that's when everything started to go wrong. I opened the diary as I sat on a fallen log, the forest eerily quiet around me. The first page was dated over 20 years ago. The handwriting was neat, but shaky, as if the writer had been in a hurry or was nervous. The entry read, "I don't know if anyone will ever find this, but if you do, please listen. Don't go into the woods at night. Don't follow the voices. And whatever you do, don't look for the cabin." I felt a chill run down my spine. The words were strange, almost like a warning, but a warning for what? I flipped to the next page, my hands trembling slightly. The second entry was even stranger. I saw it again last night, the figure in the trees. It doesn't move like a person. It doesn't feel like a person. I don't think it's human. I tried to ignore it, but it's getting closer. I can hear it whispering my name now. I looked around the woods, suddenly feeling exposed. The trees seemed darker, the shadows deeper. I told myself it was just a story, just someone's imagination running wild. But something about the words felt real. As I read further, the entries became more frantic. The writer described hearing whispers at night, seeing shadowy figures in the trees, and feeling like they were being watched. They mentioned a cabin deep in the woods, a place they had stumbled upon by accident. The cabin, they wrote, was wrong. The walls seemed to breathe. The windows showed things that weren't there, and the door wouldn't stay closed. I tried to leave, one entry read, but the woods won't let me. Every time I try to find the trail, I end up back at the cabin. It's like the forest is alive, like it's playing with me. I don't know how much longer I can stay here. I felt a growing sense of unease. The diary was starting to feel less like a story and more like a confession. I wanted to stop reading, to put the book down and walk away. But I couldn't. Something about it compelled me to keep going. The last entry was dated just a few days after the first. The handwriting was almost illegible, the words scrawled across the page in a frenzy. It read, "It's inside the cabin now. I can hear it moving around, whispering to me through the walls. It knows I'm here. It knows I can't leave. If you're reading this, please, don't come looking for me. Don't try to find the cabin. Burn this diary. Forget you ever found it, and whatever you do, don't listen to the whispers." The page ended abruptly, the ink smeared as if the writer had been interrupted. I stared at the words, my heart pounding in my chest. The forest around me felt suffocating, the trees pressing in closer. I stuffed the diary into my backpack and started walking back toward the trailhead, my mind racing. I didn't make it far before I heard it. A faint whisper, so soft I almost thought I was imagining it. It was coming from deeper in the woods, from the direction I had just come. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The whisper grew louder, more insistent, but I couldn't make out the words. It sounded like my name. I turned and ran, the diary bouncing against my back with every step. The forest seemed darker now, the trees twisting into unnatural shapes. The whispers followed me, growing louder and louder until they were all I could hear. By the time I reached my car, I was shaking so badly I could barely get the key into the ignition. I drove home in silence, the diary sitting on the passenger seat like a ticking time bomb. I wanted to throw it out the window, to leave it behind, and never think about it again. But I couldn't. Something about it wouldn't let me. That night, I dreamed of the cabin. It was exactly as the diary had described, old, rotting, and wrong. The windows glowed faintly, and the door creaked open as I approached. Inside, I could hear the whispers, louder now, almost deafening. I woke up drenched in sweat, the sound of my name still echoing in my ears. The diary is still sitting on my desk as I write this. I've thought about burning it, just like the writer said. But every time I try, something stops me. It's like the diary doesn't want to be destroyed, like it's alive. If you ever find a diary in the woods, please leave it where it is. Don't pick it up, don't read it, and whatever you do, don't listen to the whispers. It was the one rule of the house, the one thing I was told over and over again from the moment I moved in: never open the door at the end of the hall. At first, I thought it was a joke. The landlord had been oddly serious when he said it, but I figured it was just some quirky superstition. The house was old, after all, one of those creaky Victorian-style homes with too many rooms and too many secrets. Maybe the door led to a storage closet, or maybe it was stuck shut from years of neglect. Whatever the reason, I didn't think much of it, but as the days turned into weeks, the door began to bother me. It wasn't just the way it looked, tall, dark, and slightly warped, with a brass handle that seemed to glint in the dim light. It was the way it felt. Every time I walked past it, I could feel it watching me, as if it were alive. The air around it was colder, heavier, and the silence in the hallway was deafening. I should have listened to the warning. I should have left it alone, but I didn't. The first time I heard the scratching, it was late at night. I had just gone to bed, the house quiet, except for the occasional creak of the floorboards. At first, I thought it was a mouse or some other small animal. But as I lay there, listening, I realized it wasn't coming from the walls or the floor. It was coming from the door. It was faint at first, like nails lightly dragging across wood. But then it grew louder, more insistent, as if something on the other side was trying to get out. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. The sound stopped as suddenly as it had started, leaving the house in an eerie, suffocating silence. The next morning, I checked the door. There were no scratches, no signs of anything unusual. But the air around it felt colder than ever, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting on the other side. A few nights later, the whispering began. It was soft at first, barely audible, like a breeze slipping through a crack in the door. But as the hours passed, it grew louder, more distinct. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, pleading, desperate, and filled with a kind of malice that made my skin crawl. I tried to ignore it, to convince myself it was just my imagination. But the whispers didn't stop. They followed me through the house, growing louder whenever I passed the door. It was as if the door was calling to me, begging me to open it. I found the key by accident. It was hidden in a drawer in the kitchen, buried under a pile of old papers and junk. At first, I didn't know what it was for. It was small and rusted, with an ornate design that looked like it belonged to another century. But as soon as I held it in my hand, I knew. It was the key to the door. I should have thrown it away. I should have left the house and never looked back. But something about the key felt wrong. It was warm to the touch, almost pulsing, as if it were alive. And the moment I found it, the whispering stopped. For the first time in weeks, the house was silent. But the silence wasn't comforting. It was heavy, oppressive, and filled with a sense of anticipation. The door was waiting. I don't know what possessed me to do it. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the silence. Or maybe it was something else, something the door wanted. Whatever the reason, I found myself standing in front of it, the key in my hand. The air was freezing, and the hallway seemed darker than usual, the shadows stretching unnaturally along the walls. My hand trembled as I inserted the key into the lock. For a moment I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to stop. But then, with a soft click, the door unlocked. It swung open slowly, creaking on its hinges. Beyond it was darkness, thick, impenetrable, and alive. It wasn't just the absence of light, it was something more, something that seemed to reach out and pull me in. The air was heavy with the smell of decay, and the whispers returned, louder now, echoing from the void. And then I saw it. I can't describe what I saw, not fully. It wasn't human, but it wasn't an animal either. It was tall and twisted, its limbs too long and its face wrong. It didn't have eyes, but I could feel it staring at me, its gaze piercing through the darkness. Its mouth was wide, filled with jagged teeth, and it was smiling. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as the thing stepped closer. I tried to move, to run, but my body wouldn't obey. I was frozen, trapped in its gaze, as it reached out with one impossibly long hand. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the door slammed shut. The whispers stopped, and the house was silent once more. If you ever find yourself in a house with a door that shouldn't be opened, please, listen to the warning. Don't open it.